Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being an audience for this presentation that we'll be giving today, that Rachel and I have put together in the context of some work we've been doing that concerns a literature review around the potential harms associated with exposure to pornography. We would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we meet and pay our respects to elders, past, present and emerging. Given we are the last presentation for this wonderful conference, I thought that it was really important for us to include this sensitivity warning, but in fact we always include this in our material that we present. The content and the material that's been presented has been challenging, potentially distressing and confronting, and I think it's important that we always recognise that we need to practice self-care and seek help and support if it's needed. And our presentation also touches on these topics, so I think at this ending point in the conference, it's really important for us to remember that component of the work that we do, and that self-care is vital in this work. So Rachel and I are presenting on behalf of a team of people from the Australian Institute for Family Studies that have worked on this particular literature review. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background, and some of it has been more broadly covered, so I'll speed through some of that a little bit. Talk a little bit about our methods, and then Rachel's going to present some of the insights and conclusions and take some questions at that point. On the 1st of May, the Australian Government announced it is examining options to reduce people's, and in that particularly children's, exposure to violent porn, informed by experts and the best available evidence. So AFE's conducted this literature review in response to that, to assess some of the available research and evidence that's relevant in this space. And in particular, we were looking at the potential harms associated with exposure to pornography, and in particular, violent pornography. In the context of this conference, as has just been talked about by the other two speakers, it's important to recognise that exposure to pornography has become so widespread given advances in the internet and technology associated with mobile phones, as well as shifts over the last 5 years in the way in which online pornography websites have dominated the lists of internet website traffic and the broad range of content material that's available on those sites. So just broadly, some key facts. Porn is easily, anonymously and freely accessible. Most demographics in Australia watch pornography. Violence, domination and exploitation of women is common in porn, including within mainstream pornography. And by mainstream pornography, we're speaking about porn that is widely marketed and distributed and intended to make a profit for the mass market. Further concerns about violent pornography, and in fact pornography more generally, have been raised. And on the 1st of May 2024, the Minister for Communications, Michelle Rowland, stated, "There's a growing concern about the role of violent online pornography in normalising gendered violence within the Australian community." And as was mentioned earlier, the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children 2022 to 32 states that pornography is a serious concern in addressing the drivers of violence against women and children. So, although there's the discussion around violent pornography, what is violent pornography? In fact, violent pornography is not well recognised or defined within the literature, and it was one of the issues we faced in conducting this literature review. There's no consensus on a definition of violent pornography in the literature, nor consensus in relation to what constitutes a violent act within pornography. In general, studies avoid the term violent pornography or violence to classify porn that contains acts that could be classified as violent. Instead, studies often use terms like aggression as an umbrella term to refer to a variety of forms of abuse, of abusive, dominating, demeaning and coercive behaviours that involve the use of coercion or physical force. As a result, when we did this, we used a very broad definition of violent pornography so as not to be limiting on what we were uncovering. We reviewed literature about violent pornography, but also literature about aggressive, extreme and or degrading pornography, so that we captured some of the breadth of material and the nuances that are existing within these elements of pornography. A bit about our methodology, and in part this helps to explain some of the challenges we faced and also puts you into the picture of what kind of decisions we've had to make and how the literature looks in terms of what you see as our findings. We used a rapid review and we conducted the three kind of stages of that, being sampling, screening and data extraction and synthesis. We sampled from databases with a focus on health, psychology, criminology and sociology, and we conducted keyword searches in the title, abstract and keyword search fields in the literature itself, and I'll show you those in a moment. In terms of screening, we did a two-phase round of screening. We did a practical screen to provide an initial assessment of how useful a piece of literature would be in the overall review, and then a methodological screen to ensure original data was being reported with methods clearly explained in the findings seeming to be sound in the context of that. During both screening phases, we were guided by a set of eligibility criteria that we established, and these were that they were published in English from Australia or countries with a similar legal framework as it pertains to pornography. Involved the general population, were peer-reviewed, were published from the 1st of January 2017 up until when we conducted the search, which was in mid-2024. And it had to have a focus on the contents within porn and or violent impacts of porn use. To refine the focus a little bit, because there's so much literature that could have been included, we focused on the impacts that manifest in interpersonal violence, such as sexual violence perpetration or victimisation, or influencing, or things that influence people's beliefs and attitude with respect to interpersonal violence. So internalisation of sexual scripts, that was sort of alluded to before, that normalise using or experiencing sexual violence. Our data and extraction process was undertaken through a data extraction form that we created so that we captured the material that we were interested in. We did a thematic analysis and described it in a much more discussive kind of fashion as a part of our results. So here's what we ended up with as part of our methods. So we had, and as you can see, some of these terms and limitations and search strategies help you to understand where this material is coming from. We had 71 studies that were included, 59 were quantitative, 3 were qualitative, 1 was a mixed method study, and we also included 8 content analysis studies. Interestingly, most of the studies came from the US. That's about, well, I shouldn't say most, half of the studies came from the US, as in 35 of the 71, and there were only 7 from Australia. There was a variation in the age range of participants in the studies, as there was with gender. Interestingly, 21 included only males, 10 only females, and 21 studies included heterosexual participants only. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who's going to show you some of the results and findings from our literature review.
Thanks, Heather. Hi, everyone. So the first thing that we found, and I think it's a useful place to start, is that there actually needs to be more research, which might sound a bit counterintuitive, given we just said there's a wealth of stuff out there. But what we sort of mean by this is research that's really carefully designed and considers and grapples with aspects of porn use that may also be overlooked or less well understood. and also that kind of grapples with some of the definitional and methodological issues that exist in the current field. So it's kind of characterised at present by being super multidisciplinary. A lot of people are looking at this issue from a variety of perspectives, and that brings about a lot of different concepts and definitions and things like that. So it can make it really difficult to standardise or come to any definitive conclusions. So as a starting point, more research would be great. And also, as we'll circle back to, some of that research will also help us to know what sort of mitigation strategies we might want to implement as well. And it's worth noting as well, when I say those aspects of porn use that are less well understood, I also mean cohorts that might be understudied. So we're often looking at particularly white, cisgendered, heterosexual men, and often for good reasons, because we're looking at violence against women in this context a lot of the time. But we have a little bit less of an understanding about our LGBTQIA+ populations, and also women's use of porn and some of the motivations around that as well. So again, potentially super unsurprising, but porn use does not exist in a vacuum. So obviously porn is something that may be viewed as quite private, but like any other media use, it's kind of informed by an array of circumstances that are going on in a person's lives. So these may be individual, interpersonal, so based on how they interact with others around them, or communal, so a bit more broad than that. So the studies generally found that porn users may be more likely to be negatively affected by the porn that they're watching if they are young, male, and or heterosexual, use porn compulsively, frequently, or resource intensively. So that is, using funds to watch porn, so subscription services, things like that, or a variety of modes of use, so potentially computers, phones, or other media as well at the same time. Have dehumanising, morally disengaged, impersonal and or instrumental attitudes towards sex, which will sound familiar based on Chris's presentation earlier. Again, familiar, sexist or other negative attitudes towards women. Misunderstandings or minimisation of the importance of consent when it comes to sex. Identifying with porn actors, so that is sort of aspiring to be like them, and or perceiving that porn is a realistic representation of real life sex. Peer influence, so by this we mean the perception that peers are engaging with the same sorts of porn and having the same sorts of relationships with them, with the porn. Sexual sensations seeking, so this sort of overlaps with the dehumanised and morally disengaged type of perspective. Finally, next to finally, the use of degrading or violent porn specifically, so again, ding ding, it's familiar, and a young age of first exposure. So that's all of them up there in case you want to take a photo. So another finding was that porn is a primary source of sexual socialisation, and there are few other alternatives. So while it's used for a wide range of purposes, it's often used as a way to kind of develop a sexual sense of self, which is what this sexual socialisation process refers to. It's sort of the acquisition of one's, again, sexual sense of self, but also values, expectations, and things like that. So, as was alluded to earlier, a recent survey of Australian youth who were aged 15 to 20 years old showed that 86% of males, 69% of females and 85% of non-binary and other people had been exposed to porn. Another recent survey of 832 Australian youth aged 16 to 20 showed the average age for first seeing porn was 13.6 years. So again, that's just showing the level of engagement that our young people are having, and potentially, again, being driven by this sexual socialisation motive. And also, some people are specifically going to porn to learn about sexual attitudes and behaviours. And this is especially our young people and LGBTQIA+ people as well. So the impacts of porn use are not confined to individual users. What we sort of saw coming out of the studies is that the widespread and normalised nature of porn may not only impact the individuals who are watching porn, but society more broadly through a larger sort of normative effect. So there's quite a lot of interesting literature around how this actually happens, how this normalisation effect is going on. And just to speak to a few of those, the first one is this idea of cultivation theory, which essentially argues that media, a range of media, including porn, can shape individual and societal views, perceptions, beliefs, attitudes and values about the world. So as applied to porn use, this means that folks who do use porn may be more likely to hold views consistent with that porn. Another theory that's the most dominant one we saw coming up in the studies was sexual script theory. This essentially argues that sexual attitudes and behaviours in general are socially scripted and that porn is one potential source of those scripts. And that exists at a cultural level. There's a variety of different levels at which scripts can be acquired. And the final one was social learning theory, which argues that humans learn how to behave through direct experience or observation in social situations, and that overlaps with the socialisation piece that was discussed before. So theoretically, when we're seeing that porn contains these aggressive and violent themes, as Heather mentioned and was picked up in the earlier presentations, this may be creating not just an individual sort of environment that may be conducive to violence, but that is that happens in a broader context, sort of societally, as is highlighted by that quote there. So perhaps this should have been earlier on because it's a very important point, but the research field is super complex. As I said, it's multidisciplinary, it's really big, and so it should be considered very carefully. One of the things that's important to keep in mind is that although we found links between porn and a variety of different sort of characteristics, and I'll discuss those in a moment, it can't be proved easily, at least, that there's a causal relationship between watching porn and then those characteristics. So again, there's a variety of models that explain what might be going on, the sort of in-between piece, as was discussed in Chris's presentation, the confluence model being one of them. But we just have to make sure we're not making definitive statements based on this evidence base because it's super nuanced. So we have to recognise that nuanced. Having said that, the literature did point to links between porn and potentially violent attitudes and beliefs. So the first one is gendered, stereotypical and often problematic expectations of women. We've got objectifying and dehumanising perspectives of women. The normalisation of sexual violence against women, or the minimisation that it's actually having negative impacts. And broadly, sexism or other negative attitudes towards women. So again, that's all of them there. Again, the caution's there, but I won't repeat it. So the research also points to links between porn and potentially violent behaviours. So I was just discussing those attitudes and values, but these are the actual behaviours that we're seeing. So sexual aggression, sexual coercion, other forms of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and technology-facilitated abuse. Aside from those, it's also worth flagging that there were associations found between porn use and the use of rough sexual behaviours. I haven't put that up there because they're distinct from these forms of aggressive and violent behaviours. And there's nothing inherently violent or aggressive about engaging in rough sex in a consensual environment where that consent communication is really clear and boundaries have been set. But it is also worth flagging that some rough sex does carry risks of harm, for example, sexual choking, and that's particularly heightened for young women, as a study from Wright and colleagues found in 2022. So finally, it may be useful, even though this is sort of there's a caution around how we approach this evidence base, it may nevertheless be useful to proactively manage some of the risks that may be associated with porn use. And the most common approach that was recommended in the literature was porn literacy education. And this strongly overlaps with the sort of relationship education that was just flagged earlier. So teaching people about consent communication and relationship dynamics more generally. Some other mitigation options included filters or regulatory mechanisms to sort of filter out the specifically violent components of porn, although interesting to note just how much of porn could theoretically be classified as violent and isn't necessarily written about as such, so that's a bit of an interesting one. holistic gender-based violence intervention program. So that's basically looking at a range of risks that may go towards the use of violence, and treating porn as one of them. And finally, policies designed to ensure that porn is realistic. So kind of showing people that this is a fantasy and distinct from real sexual relationships, I guess. Sorry, I probably spoke for far too long, but thank you all for sticking with us. And if there's time, we can take some questions.